So can we continue to supply abundant energy to developed and developing countries around the world? I don't think we can actually do that by drilling millions of oil and gas wells around the globe. And so we have to be thinking hard and planning for, well, what actually does happen, not 10 or 20 years from now, but 30 or 50 years from now, to replace this incredibly useful and convenient source of energy as a fuel.
You know, when we talk about peak oil, nobody's talking about running out of oil. It's really about entering the end of the age of cheap oil. And if you imagine that classic sort of Hubbard bell curve, actually the half that we've been on for the last 150 years is very, very different from the other half. There's still physically the same amount of oil on both halves, but all the oil on the way up has been cheap, easy to get at, a high energy return on investment. On the downward side, actually what we've got left is things like the Alberta tar sands, fracking for gas, drilling in the Arctic, drilling in deep water. And all of those things take a huge amount more energy in order to get the energy out again. They cost a huge amount more. So actually, although there's a certain amount of recoverable oil in the second half, we may well not get that much of it because it'll just become prohibitively expensive to produce.
There are a lot of people that say, well, look, the most readily available source of energy today is conserving what we have. Is everybody using less, using energy more wisely? People will talk about, well, if only we could have more efficient automobiles or more efficient, you name it. And that is true, but what's curious is that efficiency often does not result in using less of something. In fact, quite often, efficiency results in using more of something. If all of a sudden I could just magically double fuel mileage for automobiles, would we use only half as much gasoline? Probably not. Because people would realize, oh, well, I actually can take that driving trip. I can do this. So efficiency is a good thing. I think it is a great thing. But we have to be careful about imagining that we can solve this energy problem through greater efficiency, because greater efficiency usually then means greater utility, which can often increase consumption and not cut consumption.
I think in many ways, actually, looking back, that period at the end of the 1970s when we'd had the oil shocks of the 70s, we had everything in place we needed, really, to actually start moving on. And if we'd have chosen in 1979 and said, you know what, actually, Saudi Arabia, don't worry, you can keep it. We're actually going to we're going to make sure this never ever happens again, because that was just horrible. We don't want to go there again. Instead, Reagan and Thatcher said, let's party, and we partied for another 30 years. But actually, if at that time we had decided to follow that route, we had everything in place then. So technology clearly has a role, but also I think we must also not lose sight of the fact that this will be a process about a lot more than technology, because actually it'll also be a process about moving away from what a lot of us imagined was lying ahead of us round the corner, and what we imagined was lying ahead of us for our children. It's not purely an external process of just getting the right technology.
Ultimately, we're going to move on. We moved on from wood to coal. Remember, that was seen as a great environmental improvement because we stopped deforesting. If you remember, Britain was the first one that got on the industrialization. They basically cut down virtually all their forest to burn them for their steam engines. So moving to coal was great. Then we moved to automobiles with powered by oil instead of using horses, which of course took up about a quarter of all food production. So in many ways, every new technology that we brought along has solved a problem that we were worried about in the past. And of course, we're going to stop using oil as the primary way to move cars. We're going to use electricity instead. Hopefully electricity generated by green energy. But remember, that's the argument when people say, how on earth are we going to have every Chinese have a car and every Indian have a car? Well, the solution is going to be that they're not going to be using oil.
We have already embarked clearly on the mobility revolution, and frankly, there's no way back. The fact that you today carry your cell phone, maybe a PDA application, probably a laptop or an iPad or something like that, and that you, a few years from now, will have multiple touch points with that in communications. We are already used to independent mobility as people, physical mobility, and as the electric transport happens, you will see similar interactions between the communication electronics and the electronics talking and gearing up for your car, and the connection to the smart grids. Let's assume you owned an electric car with a pretty big battery. Let's say that battery can drive 200 kilometers, so 120, 30 miles in one charge. And most of us don't drive that much. You come home to your house after a day of work, and what if you took that energy from your car instead of from the grid? If we do this in some scale, many of us believe that we will have to build no more power plants in the next 20 years.
You know, when I talk about this being a wartime mobilization, this isn't something communities can do on their own. We also need national government and legislation to support that. But I don't think there's any way of getting around the fact that the future is going to be one of less energy available per capita. But it's not necessarily the fact that actually that's going to be a complete disaster.
Over the last maybe 100 years, we've relied on fossil fuels and centralized production. And with the introduction of more renewable energy production from wind turbines, from solar panels, the energy production is going to become much more distributed, and that means that our grid is going to be used in a two-way fashion rather than just a one-directional system. And that requires a whole new design of that grid. I think we can still use the cables that are in the ground, but everything attached to the cables needs to be redesigned to facilitate that two-way direction.